Greetings and welcome, everyone. I'm Velan Hawkins, your host, and you're at the Health, Wisdom, and Wealth Show, Powerful Conversations for Living Your Best Life. And I have a couple of guests today that is we're going to be in a conversation that's a little different than what you've seen previously. And, without further ado, I'm just going to bring them in and say welcome. And I'm so happy to have you on the show and in this conversation because it's huge. And I think people need to hear what you guys have to say. So Paul Boyer, CLYDE TURPIN, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Well, Velan, thank you very much for having us.
Awesome. And our conversation is going to be about the wisdom of life, from shame to reconciliation. And I'm sure that our audience can glean some thoughts around what that might be all about. But it's just amazing to me that I could be someplace one day, not so much out of the blue, but someplace where I met a guy who had a story, and I was like, I've got to do something to get this story told far and wide because of the story. And I'm going to tell you, the story is just that: healing, reconciliation, healing self, healing others, sharing in not just the pain of what we might have experienced in life, but the rewards of taking the next step to go beyond that pain. And I want to say a little bit about the two of you, and that is, Paul Boyer is an attorney currently serving as general counsel to 2 e-commerce startups in Seattle, Washington. Paul also volunteers as a mentor with the Dispute Resolution Center in King County, Washington, and he's originally from Springfield, Virginia, close to Baltimore, okay? Right. And he's been residing in the Pacific Northwest since 2005. CLYDE, and these two have been friends for, I'll let them tell you that story, but CLYDE has been in the financial services industry since 1989. He has seen a lot of the ups and downs, the ins and outs, the turmoil, as well as the high tides in the financial services industry. And both of these gentlemen are not only bringing their stories, but they're bringing their perspectives to share with us today. So thank you again and welcome.
Thank you very much, Velan.
It's a real pleasure and an honor to be on your show. Thank you, Velan.
Thank you. So jumping right in, just tell us a little bit about how you two became friends and how it was growing up for you. I'm curious to know that.
Paul, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, CLYDE and I first met each other in 1976. We were both campers at a camp called Camp Whitehall outside of Richmond, Virginia, and spent a couple summers together. And then didn't see each other or have any contact for many, many years. And that's part of the story here. But that's how we knew each other when we were very young teenagers.
Yeah, no, go ahead, Velan.
I was just going to ask, how is that growing up for you, CLYDE?
It was, thinking back on it all, it was a pretty sheltered time. My parents sent me to a private school. I spent my summers at a small summer camp where there were 75 kids, 75 boys. And I learned how to water ski. I learned how to fish and do all those things that youngsters learn how to do at summer camp. But it was really pretty sheltered.
Okay. Well, again, just to know that there was a time, there was a place where the two of you got to interact and even become friends in that environment. Paul, maybe this is a great time for you to share the story that you wrote about. I would love for our audience to hear that.
Well, I'd be thrilled. I think that sets the stage here, and hopefully will be the foundation for a rich conversation. So I wrote this story back in early February, and I call it the Freedom from Shame story. I'm just going to read it to you all. It was 1977. I was 14 years old in my final summer at Camp Whitehall, the 6-week all-boys summer camp on the Mattaponi River outside of Richmond, Virginia. I was not keen on taking the American Red Cross swimming test that required a 500-yard swim in the murky waters of the Mattaponi. I had a fish phobia, afraid of being touched by a fish each time I found myself in the deep, dark channel of the river. My friend Clyde was in a rowboat, serving as a lifeguard for those of us taking the swim test. Clyde and I were in the same grade and had been fellow campers in the same cabin the summer before. This summer, he was a junior counselor in training. Clyde was Black, the only Black kid at Camp Whitehall, which was comprised mostly of well-heeled boys who attended St. Stephen's, a private Episcopal school in Alexandria, Virginia. I was about halfway through the swim test when the nightmare happened. I was mid-stroke when suddenly a large, slimy fish swam right up against my torso. I freaked out, practically drowning in a wave of panic. I had to get out of that river immediately. Clyde was sitting in the rowboat about 20 yards away. I thrashed through the water towards him. As I reached Clyde, I hurled myself out of the water onto the side of the boat, practically flipping it and almost catapulting him out. As I struggled to heave myself into the rowboat, a shocked Clyde yelled at me, "What are you doing? Get off!" I was desperate and hysterical. When I met Clyde's resistance, I shouted with fury, "Let me in the boat, you!" And I called my friend Clyde the N-word. I'd never called anyone that in my life before, and I never have since. I got in the boat. Clyde must have rowed us to shore. I have no recollection of what happened afterwards. The next day, Clyde and I were playing basketball together as if nothing had happened. We never spoke of that incident. I never acknowledged what I called Clyde nor apologized to him. That was my last summer at Camp Whitehall. Once camp ended, Clyde and I went our separate ways to our different high schools and then off to college. We never communicated or saw each other again. But I never forgot. I was filled with shame. What I called Clyde went against all that I knew was right and decent. I crossed a line that was unimaginable for me. That's not who I am, yet it was. Over the years, I tried to bury that painful memory, but the shame was like a searing hot coal that wouldn't go out. It was always there. And though I mostly repressed it and didn't think about the incident often, it would on occasion rear its ugly, shaming head. Saying that to Clyde was the one thing I regretted most in my life. And whenever that scene replayed in my mind, I was consumed with shame. Shame, as described by author Brene Brown, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. Intensely painful. Fast forward 43 years to last summer, June 2020, just a few weeks after George Floyd's murder. The tragedy and the Black Lives Matter protests throughout the country were prompting a racial reckoning for me and many others, and an uncomfortable growing awareness of my white privilege and racial biases. It was Saturday, June 13th, the day after my girlfriend and I had participated in Seattle's 60,000 strong, silent, powerful BLM march. We went for a day hike to an alpine lake in the Cascade Mountains. As we lunched overlooking the lake, my girlfriend mentioned how she's afraid of being touched by a fish when swimming in water where she can't see below. Suddenly, it was as if that shameful incident at Camp Whitehall leapt out of the lake like a spinning fish. I told her about my own fish phobia and sheepishly relayed the story of what I had called Clyde as the flames of shame returned. But this time was different. Instead of repressing that painful memory, I felt a sudden clarity. I needed to take action. I had to try and right this wrong. The next day, I did a Google search for Clyde, and up popped a link to a senior financial advisor in Arizona with the same name. I clicked on the link, and there appeared a photo of a black guy with graying hair along with his professional contact information. I emailed him and asked if he was the same Clyde who attended Camp Whitehall in Virginia. Clyde soon responded saying yes, and that he remembered me. I then asked if he had time for a call, as I wanted to share something about our time together at Camp Whitehall. Clyde replied that he was free at 9 and 11 the next morning. I took the leap and grabbed his 9 o'clock slot. That night, I suddenly wondered, how was Clyde going to react? Am I going to upset or anger him? For a brief period, I questioned whether this was the right thing to do. But then the clarity quickly returned. My intention was heartfelt and sincere, and I had to trust that that would come through. When Clyde answered my phone call the next morning and we heard each other's voices for the first time since 1977, he laughed when I said, "It's been a while." I asked Clyde, "How has your journey been over the past 43 years?" He opened the conversation, expressing gratitude for how fortunate he is. He's been married 34 years, has 2 sons, ages 26 and 24, and unlike his deceased parents, has a college degree and owns a beautiful home. Clyde started telling me about his grandparents. His grandfather worked as a chauffeur for a New York stockbroker, and his grandmother served as the family's maid. Clyde observed how he is now in a similar professional position as that stockbroker, something his grandparents could never have imagined. Prompted by the recent social turmoil, Clyde dove right into an authentic discussion of race in this country and shared some of the challenges and opportunities he's experienced as a Black man in America. He talked about his classmate, who at their high school graduation from St. Stephen's expressed his admiration for Clyde and how much he learned from him, then said how sorry he was that his parents would never let him invite Clyde to their home. He also recalled something his mother shared following a birthday pool party he attended. The mom of his white classmate who hosted the party told Clyde's mother that Clyde was always welcome at their home and to swim in their pool, regardless of what others may say. Clyde commended the movie Remember the Titans with Denzel Washington, a true story about the integration of the T.C. Williams High School football team, which took place in our neighboring backyard of Alexandria, Virginia, just 5 years before he and I were high school freshmen. We discussed the events of the last few weeks and how our nation finally.
We lost you for just a second there.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
No worries.
Am I back?
You're back. You want to just repeat the last sentence or two?
I think so. So we, at the risk of repeating, I'm going to say we discussed the events of the last few weeks and how our nation seems to be at an inflection point for meaningful racial change, finally. I talked about how the recent events have shined a light on some of my racial blind spots and biases and helped me gain awareness of the advantages I've had throughout my life simply because I'm a white male. We had talked for over 50 minutes when Clyde said he was going to have to jump off the phone soon and asked, didn't I have something I wanted to share about our time at Camp Whitehall? It could not have been scripted any better. The heart-to-heart discussion and Clyde sharing so openly about his experiences being Black in this country set the table perfectly. I was caught off guard by the wave of emotion that swept over me as I began relaying the incident of that large fish swimming up against me and the utter fear and panic that I experienced. I recalled how, as I heaved myself onto the side of Clyde's rowboat, almost launching him out, and then encountering his shock resistance to my desperation, I demanded that he let me in while shouting the horrible slur. I told Clyde that calling him that was my single biggest regret and how it's caused me immense shame over these many years. Through my tears, I said, "Clyde, I am so very sorry. I apologize for saying that to you." Clyde replied simply, "Apology accepted," and asked if I was okay. Just like that, the shame I'd been carrying for decades evaporated. I felt free and was aware of a tangible sense of lightness. Clyde's generous forgiveness had instantly extinguished that searing coal of shame. I thanked Clyde profoundly. Interestingly, and to my surprise, Clyde said he had no recollection of that incident, which actually added to my relief. We agreed to keep in touch. I closed our conversation saying, "Clyde, this was a treat and a gift, and I sincerely thank you." Clyde responded, "The feeling is mutual."
That is such a moving story. Thank you again for taking the time to share that with us. And Clyde, so what happened for you when Paul reached out to you? What was your reaction after he shared all of this? Did you go home and say, wow, I mean, tell us.
It was a surprise to have somebody get in touch with me after all these years, right? But apparently more commonplace today than perhaps in the past, given the power of the internet and Facebook and being able to perform Google searches and such. I really had no recollection of Paul using that term with me all those years ago. And I've thought about it since then and wondered, well, geez, you know, do we as human beings have the ability to repress unpleasant memories, you know, tuck things away in a place where, you know, it never to be heard or seen again? You know, that I don't know. What I do know is that what I've learned in life, VLAN, is if I carry a grudge against somebody, you know, the nature of the grudge is that it does me more harm than the person that I begrudge, right?
Mhm.
Because they don't know, right? They have no clue. They don't know that I'm carrying this grudge. You know, I can, you know, drive myself to have an ulcer physically, or, you know, suffer other physical or emotional maladies. Yeah, there's true power in forgiveness, for both of us, you know, for both me and for Paul. Listening to what Paul has to say and what he has experienced. Yeah, it's a pretty cool place to be, right? You know, Paul and I reconnected. He actually took a vacation here in Tucson, and we had an opportunity to go for a hike together in Catalina State Park, and that was a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful experience for me to actually to see Paul in the flesh, to continue our conversation in person. You know, there's something about, I believe, about our human physiology that, you know, it's one thing for us to connect by video. It's another thing for us to connect in person. And that's what's made this whole pandemic thing so difficult and so challenging. At our core, physiologically, we as human beings are social animals. There are rare exceptions to that, but that's who we are. We are social animals. And so being able to reconnect in person was very, very special and very meaningful. I will be grateful. I will always be grateful for Paul's bravery, right? I mean, what did it take for Paul to send that email and to pick up the telephone and call and then share what he shared, right? That's extraordinary bravery. It's a topic that is all at once terribly difficult to address and yet remarkably important to address. One of the things that kind of drawing on popular society, pop culture, the book that comes to mind is Harry Potter, believe it or not. And the power that Voldemort had on all of the other wizards in the book, in the community, right? That was Hogwarts and that whole Harry Potter community. And Harry's willingness to save Voldemort, right? To use Voldemort's name, took that power away, right? That was actually part of the solution. I think that at its core gave Harry the power, gave Harry the ability to confront Lord Voldemort and ultimately defeat him, right? One of the things I've learned in life, Len, is you can't solve for a problem that you're unwilling to admit exists, right? You've got to admit that the problem exists in order to find solution. You've got to be willing to talk about it. And on the heels of Paul getting in touch with me, I in turn got in touch with some of the people who are part of the fabric of the story that Paul related about my life, right? I remember my mom talking about how one of the other mothers in our class had shared with her that, our family was always welcome at their home and I was always welcome to swim in their pool. I got in touch with the young man, and actually neither one of us are young men anymore, right? But got in touch with him, and in light of all that was going on last summer in particular, shared with him how important, given the benefit of hindsight, how important that was for me as a youngster and for me all these years later, right? I don't think we realize as 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds or even 14 or 15-year-olds how significant some of these events in our lives really are.
Especially in times of turmoil. The 70s weren't the nicest times. I was in high school in the 70s as well. And I can tell you that while I experienced some really huge connections with some people in my class who were not of African-American descent, and
sure,
some of the places that I was around, I also felt living in not so much, I would say I didn't live in the ghetto, but I didn't live in the most prestigious parts of Baltimore either.
Sure.
And elected to go to a school that I did on purpose because I felt like it was racially diverse. It was pretty, evenly balanced with a mixture of different ethnicities, including Asian. But I still got my share of overt I'll call it mistreatment.
Mm-hmm.
And, not just from other kids, but from teachers, which really also surprised me. So, looking at how you guys grew up, you both went to private schools. Is that correct?
I did not, but I went to a public school, but it was in a affluent suburb of Washington, D.C., right outside of Alexandria, where Clyde went to school. But yeah, I was not exposed to a great deal of racial diversity growing up myself.
And Clyde, were you in a high school situation that was, I don't think I understood that you were, or maybe I just didn't hear at the time, that you were the only Black kid at this camp for summer camp. Was the school that you attended racially diverse? And as a private school, what would you say was the relationship of, Caucasians to African Americans? Is it a small percentage of African Americans, a large percentage? Tell us a little bit about that.
Very small. Very small. Back in the day, to use that phrase, back in the day, St. Stephen's was an all-boys Episcopal school, private school in Alexandria, Virginia. And my parents made the decision to send me to St. Stephen's. I was in third grade, going into third grade. And there were several stories besides the story about we were always welcome at their home and welcome to swim in their pool. There were other stories that my mom had shared over the years. The first one that comes to mind is having to take a test, an entrance exam, between second and third grade to get into St. Stephen's. And my mom sharing that the headmaster of the school, and that was the term that they used at the time. I don't know what term they use, but an Episcopal priest told my mom that I had a slight deficiency in math, but he needed her son at that school. That was his vision. He needed her son at that school. I could probably count on one hand the number of Black kids that went to St. Stephen's out of a student body of, I don't know if it was 300 or I don't think it was approaching 500, but yeah, between that story and the story about being welcome in their home and welcome to swim in their pool, I just remember all at once feeling part of the community, but not part of the community, right? V. Lynn, what I do remember is my wife went to see the movie Remember the Titans, and I didn't go, and I don't know why. Over the years, my excuse as a husband has typically been, well, I don't have time for that. I'm too busy with, Red Cross or Kiwanis or, volunteering and coaching, our boys' teams, along with working. What I do remember is after Christmas dinner one night, my wife sat me down and she made me watch Remember the Titans. And at the end of the movie, I was blubbering like a baby, because all of these disparate puzzle pieces, which made absolutely no sense individually, snapped into place and formed a portrait. I remember moving to Alexandria, Falls Church, Virginia in 6th grade. And even from 3rd grade, driving past Hammond High School in Alexandria, Virginia. Now, Hammond High School sat, basically at the intersection of I-95 and Seminary Road. And it was this beautiful facility, VLAN. I mean, a beautiful football field, a beautiful high school building that, in retrospect, thinking about, the world of public finance as an adult, it was a remarkably expensive facility to remain vacant. It was vacant from the time I was in 3rd grade until after I graduated from high school. And I never knew why. I never knew why until I watched Remember the Titans and learned that there was a lawsuit. And, the allegation before the court was, hey, separate but equal, Plessy v. Ferguson, that's not a thing. That's unacceptable and unenforceable, right? And that's what the allegation of was going on in the Alexandria school system. If you were a Black kid, on balance, you went to Hammond. If you were a white kid, you went to T.C. Williams. And the judge said, in so many words, I'm distilling this. Shut Hammond High School, and every kid in high school goes to T.C. Williams. And that was the environment I was in. And, in retrospect, it's very likely, there were probably many families, many students who, didn't fit this description, but it's very likely that, I was going to school at St. Stephen's with kids whose families sent them there because they did not want them to go to school with kids that looked like me and looked like you. Mm-hmm. And that, again, that puzzle piece didn't click until I watched Remember the Titans.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is a great segue, guys, to my next question, which is, looking at the racial, historical, and the systemic tension that we've been going through in our nation over the last year or so, that's been really overt. There's been a lot of covert stuff that has occurred, but what we've been able to see because of video and the media not being able to spin things the way that they previously have been able to. Take a few minutes and share how things today are and how you look at them. I mean, we talked about, George Floyd. We're in the midst of, the final stages after the conviction of the officer that killed him. What are you feeling about the state of affairs that in the times that we're living in right now?
Paul, you want to start?
Sure, I'll kick that off. Well, this past year has been a profound one for me on many levels. It's been a difficult one to witness all the tragedy and the suffering and injustice, but it has been a powerful one of growth for me. As I alluded to in the story, I really gained this year a whole new awareness around my racial blind spots. And I've always thought of myself as a non-racist. I have a number of African-American friends. I don't think I'm a racist, but I had to look in the mirror and realize, especially around white privilege, which is a concept that it seems so abstract that I never gave much really thought about. And suddenly, looking in the mirror, I realized, wow, Paul, you have been the beneficiary of white privilege your entire life. And to acknowledge that, and it is uncomfortable to really look in the mirror and also peel back and saying, yes, and you've got some biases. We all have biases, but to actually acknowledge them. And I think the transformation for me in many ways has been once I really owned my white privilege. First, I had to get awareness of it. And then I said, okay, I'm going to own this. And now for me, it's okay. With privilege comes responsibility. And on my journey this year, it has definitely catapulted me from being a non-racist to wanting to be an anti-racist and someone who is motivated to stand up for injustice and to try to make a difference in this world, to promote equity, promote diversity, and end systemic racism. And through this story, to the extent, this story and our story, Clyde and I, the journey we've been on here, can help bring some awareness and healing to others, that would be so meaningful to me, and it is certainly very motivating.
Well said, well said. Clyde, you have anything to say on the matter?
Sure. V-Lyn, this year has been a lot. It's a pretty simple distillation. It's been a lot. Between COVID and the pandemic and sheltering in place, and the social implications of that, the emotional and physical, psychological implications of that, seeing all of the events of the day unfold on TV, on the evening news, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. It's been a lot. What comes to mind, V-Lyn, is a conversation I had with a coworker who is a little bit older than I am, and he was he was disappointed. He expressed disappointment and despair over how there were protests, riots, whatever you want to call them, over many of the same things that people were protesting and rioting about 50 years ago, 1967, in Washington, D.C., and other large metropolises, other large cities.
Montgomery, Alabama.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about how little things have changed, right? And on one hand, that may be true. On the other hand, I'll share with you what I shared with him. I remember talking to a married couple. This was several years ago, and talking to them and saying, "Well, geez, we were carrying on a telephone conversation, and I asked the husband for some financial documents as part of a review, and asked if he had any objection sharing those documents. And this fellow responded by saying, "Clyde, no, I don't have any objection. As a matter of fact, my wife and I were just talking how ironic it is that the two people who know more about us than anybody else on the face of the earth, including our children, happen to be a Black guy and a Jew." And those are the exact words he used. And what came to mind as I was talking to my coworker in the present day is that if you think about the country where this gentleman grew up, right? This conversation took place 30 years ago. So let's say that was, in round numbers, 1990. And I think about the country where this man and his wife grew up. They grew up in a country where separate but equal was the rule of law, right? No Negroes allowed. Separate bathroom facilities, separate water fountains. Well, you can be sure that in 1967, when he went to work, his place of employment in Kansas City, there wasn't anybody that looked like me or look like you at the
Yeah.
water cooler, talking about the events of the day. As a matter of fact, he did tell me, he says, part of the irony here is that the only two Black men he knew during the course of his career was the guy that shined his shoes and the man that swept the factory floor at the end of the night. And here we are, all these years later, a Black man holds his family's, his and his wife's and his family's financial security in his hands. What a remarkable place to be. What a remarkable story. What remarkable progress. And so what I shared with my coworker was this. I said, in 1967, when that man was standing around the water cooler talking about the events of the day with his coworkers, it's a sure bet that his coworkers all looked like him, right? They were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males talking about what happened. Here we are 50 years later. I'm at the water cooler. V-Lynn, you're at the water cooler, right? There may not be a water cooler, right? But there is, you know, there's Facebook, you know, there's all sorts of ways to connect and talk about the events of the day. And the important thing is that, you know what? We are at the water cooler. And the conversation last summer was, you know, I can't tell you how many coworkers asked, wow, I can't fathom, I can't get my head around what's going on. Clyde, are you okay? How are you dealing with this? How do you deal with all of this, right? That's not a conversation that took place 50 years ago.
No, it isn't. The concern was not there. The caring was not there.
Well, the connection wasn't there.
True.
We weren't part of the conversation, right? You know?
And, you know, it is a place now where there is so much more hope for what tomorrow might be realizing versus, you know, 30, 40 years ago, the hope that we held in our hearts, and we're looking today and seeing things and asking questions like what your coworker said. You know, it really is in a lot of instances sad to say that we have not progressed farther. But we do have to also acknowledge that progress has been made.
Yep.
And there is, I believe, greater hope that more progress can be made, and in a shorter period of time. One of the reasons that makes this conversation so important, not just for us to have, but to be shared out into the world, is to let people know that things like this are occurring. We may not hear about them every day. We may not see them happening in our own world, but they are happening. And when we do get an opportunity to see them, we can also reflect and ask the question, is there something that I can do? Is there something that has occurred within my life structure that I might be able to take action like what Paul did, like what you did, reaching out to your friend? And if there isn't, is there a conversation that I can be in that might initiate or help encourage and empower someone else to have that experience? Because again, one of the things that I realize is that, you know, we're in a world that we have to recognize that everything is energy. And I know that can sound crazy to some people, but it's truth. It is actually one of those truths like Newton's, you know, law of gravity. And when you can kind of ground in that, you got to also know that healing occurs, and it must first occur in you in order for it to resonate out and impact anyone else, everyone else, because we are resonating energies. And so when we see this kind of conflict happening and, you know, all of these things stirring up, sometimes stirring up is a good thing. in order to create change. I go back to your point, and I'd love to hear your feedback about what occurred, but a lot of people were shocked at me at the response to, the devastation that was occurred when people were rioting and, buildings were burning and cars were burning, and how can people do that? And there's a couple of things to bring into what you look at when that occurs, because people can get, people get pressed against the wall. And what's the story? Your back's up against the wall, you come out and you're ready to take some action. And you take that action in order to create a massive look at change. And I believe that the riots got people talking. They got, whether it was, I'm disgusted with it, or I'm, whatever your position is, you were saying something, you felt something. For me, I was not happy to see that happen, because I know that some people really got harmed in all of that. But I also know that there was a greater energy in it occurring that created more change than if it didn't happen. If it didn't happen, it would not have gotten heard. Because it happened, some things happened. People came out. You had more leaders who were having conversations that others could hear and see were happening. You had more church leaders who were impacted by it, that started having conversations that they had actually had to admit that they were shying away from, that they were turning their backs to having prior to all of this coming about. I remember one church leader inheriting the church responsibility from his father, terrified that if he spoke his truth about how the racial disparity was impacting him, many of his church people would go away, that many of them would basically pick up their marbles and just go play marbles someplace else, because they weren't going to like that. And he actually had to stand in his position and say, it doesn't matter anymore. There is a bigger force at work. And seeing this, as a matter of fact, his church was in New York City, where some of the biggest shifts because of all of this were occurring. And while he did lose some, he gained more, because of his conviction around the fact that, truthfully, everyone is to be treated the same. Racial equality, human equality. There is no difference in how we bleed if we are cut. We're not alien. It's not green blood that's going to flow from our veins. If we can go to war together, we can live as neighbors together. If we can live as neighbors together, think about some of the change that can happen in our country. And I think that we have to continue turning the corner to get to a point where there are more people who are telling their stories like you guys are. And speaking of healing, there is so much happening in our local areas that require healing. I mean, you talked, Clyde, about being a part of the Kiwanis and the Red Cross. And while I know that these are large organizations that many look at as being, I'll say, elevated above some others that are less inclusive, both of those organizations went through a time where we Black people were not a part of what they were offering. And it can be said even today that there are only, how can I put it, only a certain few who are accepted in the ranks of some of these organizations. I look at AARP, great example of what I'm trying to express, because AARP also started, at a point in time where racial inclusivity was not part of their core value system. As they have grown and recognized that across the spectrum of older adults, they come in all sizes, shapes, hues, and they needed to address this. They were open to, embraced, and made some changes that allowed for them to grow even more exponentially because of how they began to operate. I mean, with a Black woman at the helm of AARP over the last, I don't know how many years, and going strong, growing that organization like never before. We have had to step into some of those positions, but we've also had to have help. And, Paul, I'm gonna throw this one at you right at the moment, but have you, or as you're looking back on your life, have you been in a position, have you attempted, I know I've had a lot of white people to help me in my career and on the path. And my question to you is, have you been one of those? And not to put you on the spot like that, but yes, to put you on the spot like that.
I'd like to think I have been, and I can share even before this. There's a friend, Kim Peterson, who has participated in some of our discussions. I've known Kim for over 10 years, and it was a few years ago that I really wanted to help her because she'd been so helpful to me. And I told her, Kim, I want to be one of your champions. And she started tearing up. And that touched her so much to have this white man say, I want to help you. I want to be an advocate and one of your champions. And I had no idea at the time how meaningful that would be to her. But it's been very motivating, and as I go through my life now, I'm at a point where, my purpose is clear. My purpose in life is to live a life full of growth, service, and love. And I look through that lens at everything I do. And if I can be of service to anyone, especially those who need it most, that is what I'm here on this earth to do. And I have a lot more to do. And that's why this opportunity, and I thank you, V-Lyn, for giving us this platform to share our story and maybe help others gain some awareness, maybe help promote some healing, perhaps lead to some reconciliation. And it's a powerful, experience. The gift that CLYDE gave me with his forgiveness has it's just filled me with, and healed me, and that healing gives me more power and more motivation to do more good and to use this privilege that I've been fortunate to have, gives me a level of influence that I want to use even more. I'm more committed to using that to trying to make a positive difference in this world, and now helping end systemic racism is a key aspect of that.
Beautiful, well said. And CLYDE, what's been the impact, or has there been any impact in your life and growth from young adulthood to today that has been more than influenced, but impacted by connections that you've had?
Could you repeat the question?
We're talking about the relationship of white people supporting Black people and vice versa. And have you had that experience? And if so, can you share something relating to that?
Oh, sure. Yeah, fundamentally, I've often said that my experience at St. Stephen's and my background at St. Stephen's gave me the ability to do what I do for a living, enter the financial services industry over 30 years ago, when so few of us even gave it a thought. You know, so few of us gave it a thought or gave it consideration. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I went to a summit at our company's headquarters, and it turns out that I am one of 3 African Americans, three Blacks, who have been in the industry at this firm for 30 years or more. Right? 3. And I could not have done that without my clients, right? I could not have done that without my clients, a majority of whom are like that married couple all those years ago from our country's heartland, right? Yeah, that's the that's where the hope is. That's where the inspiration is. That's where the hope is.
So if I may, Clyde, ask you, because when we were on that hike at Catalina State Park, you shared something with me that made a profound impact on me about the impact that my apology had on you. And it might be, in the spirit of healing, interesting for the audience to hear a little bit about that, because I didn't have any idea that I was doing this for me. You know, I had to clean this up for me.
Right.
But this had the ripple effect, right? And maybe to share a little bit about that from your perspective would be interesting.
Oh, wow. Now I'm embarrassed. Well, what exactly did I tell you?
Well, remember when you were saying about how you, as a Black man in America, you've gone and lived through many indignities, right? And mistreatment. And you said, Paul, do you know how many people over the course of my life have ever contacted me to apologize? You said one.
One.
You.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that is tremendous when you think about all of the things that have happened over the course of life, especially when you can say decades. And, you know, for those who are looking, for those in the audience who are looking at, you know, I've had so many things I've had to walk through. And for those who are reflecting, you know, I didn't even realize the impact of some of the things that I did. But as I think about them, I can honestly say that they were regretful actions. And, you know, there's 2 schools of thought. One is taking action, Paul, like you did, and reaching out to Clyde. And Clyde taking action like you did and reaching out to your friend and letting him know what that meant, what having his mother say that meant to your mother and to you. And, you know, one of the things that I'm grateful for was from the time that I was in junior high school and high school, I did purposefully, and this was my choice, because a lot of our African-American communities wanted to stay in segregated, safe environments, our own selves. And, you know, there's this thing now where it's still Sunday morning is still the most segregated time in the lives of more people than anything. You know, we work in typically in diverse environments. We shop in diverse environments, but we go to church with those who are like us, and that's all you see in church. And I have, and I'm speaking about churches, but I have always been drawn to the communities that were consistently diverse and speaking inclusion, and not just speaking it, but living it. And the churches that have, you know, inclusivity and reconciliation, and reconciliation can go, you know, to self, to one other, or to many others. And that's part of the structure of the core value system that I have looked for myself personally. Now, I know that hasn't been the case for everyone. It's not the case for everyone. People want to be where they feel comfortable. And I feel comfortable having a myriad of people. I mean, think of the kind of experiences you can have. And, you know, I think that's part of the richness of life. And so, you know, with siblings and friends, do you find that you are in circles with siblings and friends who don't necessarily share the value of inclusiveness? And how does that make you feel? Clyde,
Feels uncomfortable.
and can you expound on that?
You know, it feels uncomfortable, and yet that's part of what needs to be done, I would imagine, right?
In terms of continuing that norm?
In terms, no, not in terms of continuing that norm, in terms of social change, in terms of continuing making progress to the world that Dr. King painted a vision of, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, progress isn't linear. Progress, you know, you make some progress, and, you know, two steps forward, 3 steps forward, maybe 1 step back. Yeah, it's I'm struggling here. It's part of what's necessary to turn Dr. King's dream into a reality, I would imagine.
For me, it's, you know, I'm trying to become more educated in areas and shine even brighter lights on these blind spots, so that I am positioned to use my influence to make a difference. And whether it's participating in our company's anti-racist book club that was started this summer, right after the George Floyd murder. And I wish it were more broadly attended, but we have a core group that every month we get together. Or, you know, as I met you, Vlen, through Maureen's BIPOC grief meeting every month, right? That was a great opportunity for me in a diverse community to learn more and to become more educated and aware, and then hopefully, you know, expand and share my learnings with my community and help bring awareness to others.
Awesome. Yes. And I think that as more people actually see, embrace, and invite into opportunities like that, we will continue to see the greater change. And I'm looking at our time. I'm so grateful you guys have spent this kind of time with me. As we come to a close here, I just want to ask one really big favor and question, and that is, share with our audience some wisdom that, you know, in this subject of release and freedom and reconciliation and bringing harmony to self and to others because of it. Share some wisdom that you believe might be important for our audience to have and to know as we wrap things up here.
Wow. Paul?
Sure, I'll kick it off. You know, there's a quote that I can't share verbatim, but paraphrasing Maya Angelou about once you know better, you can do better. And that's where I am, trying to know better. And I think if all of us had that growth mindset, if we know better, then we have the awareness to do better. And if we're all doing better, our society will be a much more wonderful place to live.
Yes, thank you for that. I love that, Paul. Clyde?
I would say keep showing up and yeah, address the elephant in the living room. I think that's pretty powerful. You can't solve for a problem that you refuse to admit exists. So acknowledge the elephant in the living room.
Awesome. That's a good one too. Yeah. You know better, do better, and in knowing better and doing better, you have to address the elephant in the room. You will want to address the elephant in the room.
Exactly.
And that's what creates sustainable change. That's what creates the energy of harmony and resonating the healing that we all need. And it ultimately goes out to healing the planet.
Yeah.
And, you know, as we talk about health, wisdom, and wealth, we have to acknowledge that everything that we do that really takes us to the next level of understanding around life, relationships, around health, around wealth, building it, keeping it, generationally, legacy, all of that comes into play. And it happens more free flowing. You know, you talked, Paul, about the fact that, you know, you were impacted by this occurrence for all of these years, and releasing it just allowed the freedom of being able to do the next thing, standing in your courage, having a voice that takes you to the next level. And with that, thank you so much, gentlemen. I so appreciate you coming together with me, sharing your message, sharing your hearts, and allowing our audience to get to know you as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Leland, the pleasure is mine. I'm very grateful for the opportunity and hope that this has a positive impact and makes a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you. This was wonderful, Leland.
Thank you. Thank you both. And until next time, remember, live, love, be a bigger positive impact in your world, and be well until we see you next time. Bye for now.